A man died in 1875 carrying a love letter he'd kept close to his heart for 45 years. The woman who wrote it had married someone else. She'd rejected him, like almost everyone he'd ever loved rejected him. But millions of children around the world knew his stories. They just had no idea how much of his pain he'd woven into every page. Hans Christian Andersen wrote The Ugly Duckling, The Little Mermaid, The Snow Queen. Stories that have survived nearly 2 centuries. Stories translated into over 125 languages. But the man who created them spent his entire life feeling like he didn't belong anywhere. He was too poor for the rich, too strange for the normal, too sensitive for the world he inhabited. And that's exactly why his stories still matter. This is the story of how a boy from the worst slum in Denmark, a kid who could barely spell, who was mocked relentlessly, who failed at almost everything he tried, somehow became the most famous writer in Europe. It's not a fairy tale, it's stranger than that. April 2nd, 1805, Odense, Denmark, the 3rd largest city in the country, which meant it had maybe 6,000 people. Hans Christian Andersen was born in a one-room house in the poorest quarter of town. One room, not one bedroom. One room total for living, sleeping, working, everything. His father was a 22-year-old shoemaker, sickly, barely making enough to survive. His mother was older, illiterate, working as a washerwoman when she could get the work. They were about as poor as you could be in early 19th century Denmark, without actually starving to death. The house still stands today, though how much of it is original is questionable. Tourists visit it, they take photos, they imagine a quaint, humble beginning for a beloved children's author. But there was nothing quaint about it. It was crushing poverty, the kind where you don't have privacy because privacy is a luxury, the kind where your mother washes other people's dirty clothes just so you can eat. Hans Christian had a half-sister named Karen. His father, also named Hans, told stories about the family being descended from nobility. His grandmother had fed him these tales, said they'd belonged to a higher social class once, that they'd fallen on hard times. Every investigation since has proven this was fantasy, just a poor family telling themselves stories to feel less poor. But here's something nobody could prove or disprove. Some people thought Andersen might have been the illegitimate son of King Christian VIII. The timing worked. The circumstances of his education later in life, the way certain doors opened for him that should have stayed shut, these fueled the speculation. Danish historian Jens Jørgensen even wrote a book arguing the case. Was it true? Probably not, but the fact that the rumour existed at all tells you something about how unlikely Andersen's rise actually was. He was baptised on April 15th, 1805 at St. Hans Church in Odense, 13 days after birth, which was standard for the time. His parents spoiled him, as much as people with nothing can spoil anyone. They encouraged his imagination because imagination was free. And his imagination was the one thing he had in abundance. His father read to him constantly. Arabian Nights, the Bible. These weren't children's books. They were the only books the family owned, sitting on a shelf above his father's workbench. That shelf was the one thing from his childhood Andersen always spoke fondly of later. Not his home, not Odense, just that shelf of books. His father also took him to see plays by Ludvig Holberg, the Danish playwright. Theatre tickets were cheap if you stood in the back. Young Hans Christian was mesmerised. His father built him a toy theatre out of scrap materials, and the boy would stage elaborate dramas with handmade puppets, performing for anyone who would watch. His grandmother told him folk tales, old Danish legends passed down through generations of poor women who couldn't read but could remember. Hans would act these out too, in his puppet theatre, modifying them, adding his own flourishes. He was creating stories before he could properly write them down. The house had no privacy, none. People were always there, always watching, always present. Some biographers think this forced him to retreat into his mind. Physical privacy was impossible, so he built mental privacy instead, constructing elaborate worlds nobody else could enter. That complete lack of privacy, that suffocating closeness of poverty, it shaped everything about how he saw the world. It's why so many of his stories feature characters who are trapped, who long to escape, who dream of transformation into something else, somewhere else. Then April 26th, 1816, his father died. Hans Christian was 11 years old. The family was already barely surviving. Now they were truly alone, just a boy and his illiterate mother, with no income and no prospects. Most boys in that situation would have been apprenticed out immediately, sent to learn a trade to become useful. But Anne-Marie Andersen let her son stay in school. Occasionally. He didn't attend regularly. He couldn't. They needed money. He was a loner. Other children mocked him relentlessly. He was effeminate in his mannerisms, sensitive, strange. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but repeated often enough that it might be true, about children at a factory where he briefly worked physically, stripping his clothes off to check if he was actually female. The humiliation scarred him, like the duckling, teased, humiliated, different, unable to understand why he didn't fit anywhere. He stayed away from school more and more, but he kept reading, kept going to the theatre whenever he could sneak in or afford the cheapest standing spot, kept performing his puppet shows, kept living in stories because reality was unbearable. At 14, something shifted. He convinced his mother to let him go to Copenhagen, the capital, the real city, not this provincial town where everyone knew he was the weird poor kid. She asked what he planned to do there. His answer has become famous. "I'll become famous. First you suffer cruelly, and then you become famous." That's not a normal thing for a 14-year-old to say. It's not even a normal thing for an adult to say. But he believed it with absolute certainty. The suffering was already happening. The fame must be coming next. That's how stories worked. He'd saved 13 riksdaler. Not much, but enough for the journey, and maybe a week or two in Copenhagen if he was careful. On September 4th, 1819, a few months after his confirmation in the Lutheran church, he left Odense. His mother let him go, probably because she understood there was nothing for him there. Maybe she believed him. Maybe she just didn't have the heart to crush that impossible dream. The decision to let him leave was influenced by one crucial fact. Odense had a theatre. It was the only town outside Copenhagen with one, so Hans Christian had seen actual professional productions, not just travelling shows. He knew what real theatre looked like. He knew it was possible. Copenhagen was where it all happened, where the Royal Theatre stood, where careers were made. He arrived in Copenhagen with no connections, no plan, and 13 riksdaler. A printer in Odense had given him a letter of introduction to a dancer. That was it. That was his entire network. He presented himself to this dancer, showed up at her home, and proceeded to sing and dance in his stocking feet in front of her astonished guests. They laughed. Not with him, at him. His manner was absurd. His behaviour was brash and completely inappropriate for a poor boy addressing his social betters. But he didn't understand social codes. He'd never learned them. He just knew he could perform, and performing would make him famous. It didn't. The next 3 years were brutal. He lived in one of Copenhagen's worst neighbourhoods. He tried to join a boys' choir and succeeded for a while, earning a little money singing. Then his voice changed. Suddenly that avenue closed. He tried to become an actor. Too awkward. He tried ballet. Too gangly and uncoordinated. He tried manual labour. Couldn't do it. His hands weren't made for that kind of work, and his mind was always elsewhere, lost in stories and dreams. But he never considered going home. Going back to Odense would mean admitting defeat, and he'd rather starve in Copenhagen than return as a failure. So he starved, or nearly. He slept in terrible rooms. He went hungry. He was desperately lonely. But he stayed. 3 years of this, trying everything, failing at everything. Writing plays that nobody wanted to produce, poems that nobody wanted to publish, living on scraps and stubborn belief that somehow, eventually, someone would see his talent. At 17, someone finally did. Jonas Collin was a director of the Royal Theatre and an advisor to the king. He'd seen a play Andersen had written, probably one of the many he'd submitted unsuccessfully. Most directors would have dismissed it outright. The writing was rough, the spelling atrocious, the structure amateur. But Collin saw something underneath the flaws. Raw talent, potential, maybe genius, if it could be properly educated. Collin did something extraordinary. He approached King Frederick VI and convinced him to pay for Andersen's education. Not fully. The king agreed to cover part of the costs. Collin raised the rest from other patrons. It was an unprecedented opportunity for a boy from the slums, and it came with enormous pressure. Hans Christian Andersen was being given a chance that almost nobody from his background ever received. He couldn't waste it, but school would prove to be one of the most painful experiences of his life, and he'd already lived through plenty of pain. The education began in Slagelse, a town on the Danish island of Zealand, not far from Copenhagen. Later, he'd moved to Helsingør. These weren't progressive schools. They were traditional, rigid, brutal by modern standards. Andersen struggled immediately. He was an average student at best, possibly because he suffered from dyslexia, though that condition wouldn't be identified or understood for another century. His spelling remained terrible his entire life. His handwriting was messy. He couldn't seem to absorb information the way other students did. The other pupils mocked him. Of course they did. He was older than most of them, having started formal education late. He was poor, he was strange, and he kept insisting he was going to be a famous writer, which made him seem delusional to children from respectable families who had normal ambitions. The teachers were worse. They discouraged his writing, told him to focus on practical subjects, told him he'd never amount to anything if he kept chasing fantasies. One teacher in particular seemed to take pleasure in humiliating him. At one point, Andersen lived at the headmaster's house in Slagelse, supposedly to receive extra attention and tutoring. Instead, he was treated badly, physically abused, subjected to what the headmaster called character building. Andersen later described this period as the bitterest time of his life, worse than the poverty in Odense, worse than the 3 starving years in Copenhagen, because now he was being given an opportunity, and he was failing, or being told he was failing, and he couldn't escape because Jonas Collin and the king were paying for this, expecting results, expecting him to transform into something respectable. By 1827, his despair had become obvious enough that Jonas Collin intervened again. He removed Andersen from the school and arranged for private tutoring in Copenhagen, away from the sadistic headmaster, away from the mocking students. Just Andersen and a tutor working through the material at his own pace. It worked. In 1828, at 23 years old, Hans Christian Andersen passed the entrance exams for the University of Copenhagen. He was behind his peers by years, but he'd made it. Against every reasonable expectation, the shoemaker's son from Odense's worst slum was now a university student. And that's when his actual writing career finally began to take shape, though not in the way anyone expected. In 1829, during his first year at the University of Copenhagen, Andersen published a short story called A Journey on Foot from Holman's Canal to the East Point of Amager. The title was pedestrian. The story was anything but. It caught attention immediately, not because it was perfect, but because it had a voice that Danish literature hadn't heard before. Informal, conversational, almost chatty. It broke rules the way Andersen himself had broken every social boundary to get this far. That same semester, he published a comedy, then a collection of poetry. He was writing everything, throwing ideas at the wall to see what stuck. He had no intention of being one thing. Playwright, poet, novelist, whatever paid, whatever got noticed. The university gave him legitimacy, but it didn't feed him or pay his rent. He needed to make money from his writing, and fast. The king noticed. Frederick VI, who'd already paid for part of Andersen's education, decided the young writer showed enough promise to invest further. In 1833, he granted Andersen money for travel. Not a small amount either, enough to spend 16 months wandering through Germany, France, Switzerland, and Italy. This was transformative. Andersen had barely left Zealand before this. Now he was seeing Europe, absorbing other cultures, other languages, other ways of telling stories. Italy particularly captivated him. The warmth, the art, the casual beauty of everyday life. He felt more at home there than he'd ever felt in Denmark, which tells you something about how Denmark had treated him. He took notes constantly, observations about places, people, customs. Everything was material. When he returned to Copenhagen in 1834, he had enough ideas to fuel years of writing. And he had something else too. Distance had given him perspective on his own life, his own struggles. He could see the pattern now, the ugly duckling who had become a swan. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was his story. In 1835, two things happened that would define the rest of his life. First, he published The Improvisatore, a novel based on his time in Italy. The book was basically his autobiography, with the names changed. A poor but talented boy rises from nothing to become an artist. The critics loved it. Not just in Denmark, but in England and Germany too. Suddenly Hans Christian Andersen wasn't just a promising young writer. He was an actual novelist with an international reputation. But the second thing he did in 1835 would matter far more, even though nobody noticed it at the time. He published a small booklet of fairy tales, 4 stories written for a little girl named Ida Tiele, whose father worked at the Academy of Art. The stories were Little Ida's Flowers, The Tinderbox, Little Claus and Big Claus, and The Princess and the Pea. He called the collection Fairy Tales Told for Children. He published it almost as an afterthought, a minor project between serious work. Andersen had no idea these stories would be what people remembered him for. He thought he was a novelist and poet who happened to write a few children's tales on the side. The fairy tales were throwaway work, quick and easy, not the serious literature he aspired to create. The reviews that appeared in 1836 confirmed his suspicion. Danish critics hated them. The style was too informal, too chatty. Children's literature was supposed to educate, to teach moral lessons in proper elevated language. Andersen's tales were too playful, too conversational. Some critics thought they were actually immoral, which seems absurd now, but made sense in the context of 1830s Danish literary culture. The criticism stung. Andersen considered giving up on fairy tales entirely. He had a successful novel. He was being taken seriously as a writer. Why waste time on stories that critics despised? But he couldn't quite let them go. Something about the form appealed to him. The freedom it offered, the way you could blend reality and fantasy, tragedy and comedy, in ways that serious adult literature couldn't. He kept writing them slowly, publishing new collections every few years. What Andersen was doing was genuinely revolutionary, though nobody recognized it yet. Previous fairy tale collections, like the ones by the brothers Grimm, were essentially transcriptions of folk tales, stories that had existed orally for generations, written down with minimal alteration. Andersen started there too. Some of his early tales were retellings of stories he'd heard from his grandmother in Odense, but he quickly moved beyond retelling. He started inventing his own stories, original fairy tales that had never existed before. Out of the 156 fairy tales and stories he would eventually publish, only 7 were retellings. The rest came entirely from his imagination. More importantly, he changed how fairy tales were told. The brothers Grimm wrote in a formal literary style. Andersen wrote the way people actually spoke. He used idioms, slang, conversational rhythms. He addressed the reader directly. It felt less like reading a book and more like having someone tell you a story face to face. This drove the critics insane. It violated every rule of proper literature, but it made the stories immediate and alive in a way that formal fairy tales weren't. In 1845, he published a new collection and changed the title from Fairy Tales Told for Children to new fairy tales. The shift was subtle but significant. He was no longer positioning these as children's stories specifically. They were fairy tales, period. For anyone who wanted to read them, the stories in these collections from 1845 onward are considered his finest work: The Little Mermaid, The Ugly Duckling, The Snow Queen, The Steadfast Tin Soldier. These weren't simple children's tales with clear moral lessons. They were complex, often dark, psychologically rich stories that worked on multiple levels. The Little Mermaid isn't just about a girl who wants to be human, it's about sacrificing everything for love and getting nothing in return. The mermaid literally loses her voice, endures constant pain, and in the end, the prince marries someone else. The original version doesn't have a happy ending. She dies, turns to sea foam. Later editions softened this, but Andersen's version was brutal. The Ugly Duckling is obviously autobiographical. The duckling who's rejected by everyone, who suffers through cold and loneliness, who finally discovers he's actually a swan. That's Andersen's entire life condensed into a children's story. Except he never quite believed he'd become a swan. Even after success, he felt like the duckling. The Snow Queen is one of his longest and most ambitious tales. It's about a boy named Kay who gets ice in his heart and eyes, making him cold and cruel. His friend Gerda goes on a quest to save him, travelling through multiple dangerous encounters. The story is basically about how love can redeem someone who's lost themselves, but it's told through this elaborate fantasy framework that feels almost mythological. What made these stories powerful was that Andersen never talked down to his audience. He didn't simplify emotions or sanitize difficult subjects. His characters suffered real pain, made bad choices, sometimes died. The world of the fairy tales was often cruel and unfair, just like the real world. This is why children loved them and adults found meaning in them too. They weren't preachy. They didn't offer easy answers. They just told stories about being alive, about struggling, about the gap between what you want and what you get. By 1852, Andersen had become confident enough to change the label again. Some of his new work was called stories rather than fairy tales. The distinction mattered. Stories were more realistic, more experimental, often aimed at adults. He was pushing the boundaries of what the form could do. But even as the fairy tales were slowly building an audience, Andersen still considered himself primarily a novelist and poet. The fairy tales were a side project that happened to be popular. His real work was the serious stuff. This self-perception would persist his entire life. He never fully understood that the fairy tales were his greatest achievement. He kept writing novels that nobody remembers now, kept writing plays that were rarely performed, kept thinking that someday he'd create the great serious work that would justify his talent. Meanwhile, the fairy tales were spreading across Europe. Translated into German, English, French, parents read them to their children. The stories started embedding themselves in culture, becoming reference points, shaping how people thought about narrative and metaphor. But we're getting ahead of the story. In the late 1830s, Andersen was still just a promising Danish writer with a growing reputation. He'd published a successful novel. He'd published some fairy tales that got mixed reviews. He was making enough money to support himself barely, and he was about to discover something that would cause him pain for decades. He was terrible at love, not just unlucky, genuinely, catastrophically bad at romantic relationships. And this failure would haunt him, shape his work, and leave him lonely despite being surrounded by admirers. The first heartbreak came in 1830, before the university, before the fairy tales. He met a girl named Reborg Voigt. He fell completely, desperately in love. She was already engaged to someone else. It didn't matter to Andersen. He poured his feelings out to her anyway, wrote her letters, made his devotion embarrassingly clear. She was kind about it. But she married the other man. Andersen was devastated. Decades later, when he died, they found a small pouch hanging around his neck containing a long letter from Reborg. He'd carried it his entire life, never let go of that first heartbreak. Then there was Sophie Ørsted, daughter of the famous physicist Hans Christian Andersen. Andersen fell for her too. She wasn't interested. The rejection hurt, but at least it was quick and clear. Louise Collin was worse. She was Jonas Collin's youngest daughter. Andersen had known the Collin family for years. They'd supported him, helped him, treated him almost like family. He developed feelings for Louise, proposed to her. She turned him down, gently but firmly. They remained friends, which somehow made it more painful. The pattern was always the same. Andersen would fall in love with someone who didn't love him back. He'd make his feelings known in ways that were too intense, too desperate. The woman would reject him. He'd be heartbroken but would somehow stay connected to her, unable to move on cleanly. The worst case was Jenny Lind, the Swedish opera singer. She was famous across Europe, celebrated for her voice and her presence. Andersen became infatuated with her. For years he convinced himself that she felt the same way. She didn't. She saw him as a friend, maybe even a mentor, but never as a romantic partner. He wrote her letters that were embarrassingly passionate. He visited her constantly when she performed in Copenhagen. He dedicated poems to her, and she tolerated it all with grace, but she never reciprocated. When she finally married someone else, Andersen was crushed. But even then, he couldn't let go. He continued writing to her, continued thinking about her, continued holding on to the fantasy that somehow, someday, things might change. They always rejected him the same way, gently, kindly, with affection even, which somehow made it worse, because Andersen couldn't hate them for it, couldn't turn the rejection into anger and move on. Instead, he absorbed it, internalized it, let it confirm what he'd always suspected about himself, that he was unlovable, that something fundamental was wrong with him. The fairy tales started reflecting this, not obviously, not in ways critics noticed at first, but the outsiders in his stories, the ones who didn't fit, the ones who loved without being loved back. These weren't just literary devices, they were him. The Ugly Duckling isn't subtle about this. Written in 1843, it's basically Andersen's autobiography disguised as a children's story. A creature who doesn't belong anywhere, mocked and rejected by everyone, convinced there's something deeply wrong with him. And then the transformation, the discovery that he was never ugly, just different, that he belonged to a different category entirely. Andersen saw himself as the duckling, believed that eventually people would recognize his true worth, that the rejection and loneliness were temporary conditions, not permanent states. But here's what's heartbreaking about that interpretation. The duckling becomes a swan and finds his place with other swans. Andersen never did. He spent his entire life as a duckling in swan circles, never quite fitting, always aware of the gap between himself and the people around him. The Little Mermaid, written in 1837, cuts even deeper. A creature who gives up everything for love, who transforms herself, makes herself suffer, sacrifices her voice, literally. And the prince never even notices. He marries someone else. The mermaid dissolves into foam. The original version is brutal. No happy ending, no magical rescue, just unrequited love and self-destruction. Andersen wrote this while obsessing over Edvard Collin. Edvard was Jonas Collin's son, and Andersen's relationship with him was complicated in ways that made the romantic rejections look simple. They'd known each other since Andersen was a teenager. They'd grown up together, in a sense, and Andersen loved him. Whether that love was romantic, platonic, or something else entirely is something scholars still argue about. The letters Andersen wrote to Edvard are intense, passionate. He begged Edvard to use the informal du with him instead of the formal de. Edvard refused for years. In Danish, the distinction matters. Du implies intimacy, equality. De maintains distance, hierarchy, Andersen desperately wanted to close that gap. Edvard kept it open. They corresponded for decades. Andersen would pour out his feelings. Edvard would respond coolly, rationally, maintaining boundaries. It was torture for Andersen, but he couldn't stop. When The Little Mermaid was published, Edvard didn't recognize himself in it. Or if he did, he never acknowledged it. Andersen had written him into a story about unrequited love and self-sacrifice, and Edvard just read it as another fairy tale. This pattern defined Andersen's emotional life: intense feelings that weren't returned, desperate attempts to close distances that other people wanted to maintain, and through it all, the fairy tales, absorbing these experiences, transforming them into something universal. Because here's what makes Andersen's work endure. The specificity of his pain became universal through the transformation into fairy tale form. Everyone's felt like the Ugly Duckling. Everyone's experienced the Little Mermaid's unrequited devotion. The stories work because they're both deeply personal and completely accessible. But living that life was agony. Andersen travelled constantly, partly to promote his work, partly to escape Denmark. He'd achieved fame by the 1840s. His fairy tales were being translated across Europe. He was invited to the homes of aristocrats and artists. He met kings and queens, and he was miserable. The external validation didn't touch the internal emptiness. Being celebrated as a writer didn't make him less lonely. If anything, it made the loneliness more acute because now he had everything except the one thing he actually wanted, which was to be loved, not admired, not celebrated, just loved, simply and directly, by someone who chose him. He never got it. There were friendships, certainly. The Collin family remained important to him despite the painful dynamics. He had admirers and correspondents across Europe. He was welcomed in aristocratic homes. But intimacy, real connection, that eluded him. He was too needy, too intense, too emotionally demanding. People liked him in small doses, but couldn't handle sustained exposure to his personality. Even his triumphs turned bitter. In 1867, when he returned to Odense for a celebration in his honour, the city that had once mocked him now claimed him as their greatest son. They gave him honorary citizenship. Huge crowds turned out, and Andersen, who dreamed of this kind of recognition for decades, found it hollow. The approval he'd craved as a child meant nothing now that he had it. The people celebrating him didn't know him. They knew his work, his reputation. Not him. The fairy tales kept coming. The Snow Queen in 1844, the Red Shoes in 1845, the Little Match Girl in 1845. Each one a masterpiece, each one carrying hidden depths that children wouldn't notice but adults might recognise. The Little Match Girl is particularly dark. A child freezing to death on New Year's Eve while people celebrate inside warm houses. She lights matches to stay warm, sees beautiful visions, and dies. The story ends with her frozen corpse being discovered the next morning. People found her dead with matches scattered around her. They said she'd been trying to warm herself. They didn't know she'd seen beautiful things in the flames. The visions were private, unshareable, like Andersen's inner life. He published 156 fairy tales and stories over his career. Some are adaptations of folk tales. Most are completely original. Together, they form a body of work that's shaped Western culture in ways we barely notice because they're so embedded in how we think. The Emperor's New Clothes gave us a phrase. The Ugly Duckling became a metaphor. The Princess and the Pea entered the collective imagination. These aren't just children's stories, they're mythology, modern folklore that emerged from one lonely man's attempt to make sense of his pain. By the 1850s, Andersen was internationally famous. His books sold across Europe. He was granted a pension by the Danish king, ensuring financial security for life. He travelled to England, France, Germany, Sweden. He met Charles Dickens. That meeting, in 1847, went well initially. Dickens admired Andersen's work. They corresponded afterward. Then Andersen visited Dickens' home in 1857, planning to stay 2 weeks. He stayed 5 weeks. Dickens grew increasingly desperate for him to leave. Andersen didn't pick up the hints. He was oblivious to social cues, unable to read when he'd overstayed his welcome. Finally, Dickens had to be direct about it. After Andersen finally left, Dickens put a note on the guest room door. Hans Andersen slept in this room for 5 weeks, which seemed to the family ages. The friendship ended. Dickens stopped responding to Andersen's letters. Another rejection, another relationship Andersen had misread and ruined through his own neediness. This happened repeatedly. Andersen would form what he thought were deep friendships. He'd invest emotionally, write passionate letters, make demands for intimacy that the other person wasn't willing to meet. They'd pull back. He'd be hurt and confused. He couldn't see what he was doing wrong, couldn't understand why people who seemed to like him initially would eventually distance themselves. The pattern was clear to everyone except him. The fairy tales got stranger as he aged, more experimental, less concerned with children's expectations. The later collections dropped "Told for Children" from the title and became simply stories. He was writing for adults now, or at least for readers sophisticated enough to handle ambiguity and darkness. The tales became more allegorical, more philosophical, less about magic and transformation, more about the human condition. The Shadow, published in 1847, is particularly unsettling. A man's shadow detaches and becomes independent. The shadow grows powerful while the man weakens. Eventually, the shadow takes over completely, and the man becomes the shadow's shadow. It ends with the man being executed while the shadow marries a princess. What does that mean? Critics have debated it for over a century. Is it about the relationship between the artist and his work? About how public personas can overtake private selves? About the darkness within us gaining control? Andersen never explained. He was done with simple morals and clear messages. The later tales were puzzles, questions without answers, explorations of psychological territory that children's literature wasn't supposed to touch. But they're still fairy tales. They still have that quality of existing slightly outside normal reality, in a space where anything can happen, and the rules of the everyday world don't quite apply. This is what makes Andersen's work so slippery to categorize. They're children's stories that adults can't fully understand. They're simple on the surface and infinitely complex underneath. They work on multiple levels simultaneously. A child reading The Little Mermaid sees a story about a mermaid who wants to become human. An adult might see a story about impossible love and self-destruction. Neither reading is wrong. Both exist in the same text. This ambiguity, this depth beneath apparent simplicity, this is what separates Andersen from other fairy tale writers. The Grimm brothers collected folk tales and wrote them down. Andersen created new myths from scratch, using the fairy tale form to explore psychology and emotion in ways the novel couldn't quite manage. By the 1860s, he was slowing down. Age and illness were catching up with him. He still travelled, but less frequently. Still wrote, but with more effort. The output decreased, though the quality remained high. His last fairy tale, Auntie Toothache, was published in 1872. It's bizarre, experimental, barely recognisable as a children's story. A meditation on pain and art and the price of creation. Fitting for a final work. He was 67 years old. He'd spent over 40 years writing fairy tales, and he was still alone. The loneliness never left. The hunger for connection, for love, for someone to see him and choose him. It stayed with him until the end. All the fame, all the success, all the recognition, none of it filled that void. In 1872, he fell and injured himself. The injury didn't heal properly. He developed complications. His health deteriorated over the next 3 years, slowly, painfully. He knew he was dying. He started putting his affairs in order, making arrangements, saying goodbyes, and he was afraid, terrified actually, not just of death itself, but of being buried alive. This was a common fear in the 19th century. Medical knowledge was imperfect. People occasionally woke up in coffins. Andersen obsessed over this possibility. He left instructions that his veins should be cut before burial, just to make absolutely certain he was dead. He also worried about his legacy, about how he'd be remembered, about whether the fairy tales would endure or be forgotten. He needn't have worried about the fairy tales. On August 4th, 1875, Hans Christian Andersen died in Copenhagen at a friend's house. He was 70 years old. The cause was liver cancer, though complications from the fall 3 years earlier had accelerated his decline. His funeral was a state occasion. Thousands lined the streets. The King of Denmark attended. Flags flew at half-mast across the country. For a man who had spent his entire life desperate for love and recognition, the outpouring was enormous, but he wasn't there to see it. And that's the cruel irony of Andersen's story. He got everything he wanted except the one thing he needed. The fairy tales survived him immediately. Within months of his death, new translations appeared. Publishers rushed to capitalize on the renewed interest. The stories spread further, faster, reaching audiences Andersen had never imagined. By the 1880s, they were being taught in schools across Europe. By the 1890s, they'd reached America, Asia, and Africa. The translations multiplied. Some were faithful to the original Danish. Others took liberties, softening the darker elements, adding happy endings where Andersen had left ambiguity. The Little Mermaid became a particular victim of this sanitizing impulse. Disney's 1989 version gave her a happy ending, a voice, and a name, Ariel. Millions of children grew up believing that's how the story goes. The original, where she dissolves into foam, became a footnote, a curiosity for literary scholars. But the strange thing is, both versions work. The Disney adaptation is genuinely good storytelling, just different storytelling. It captures something of Andersen's original, the longing, the sacrifice, the desire to transform, while jettisoning the tragedy. You can argue about whether that's a betrayal or an evolution. People have been arguing about it for decades. The same thing happened to most of his famous tales. They were adapted, modified, commercialized, and simplified. The rough edges were filed down. The psychological complexity was stripped away. What remained were the basic narratives, the iconic images, a mermaid longing for land, an emperor with no clothes, an ugly duckling becoming a swan. These images became universal. They transcended Andersen. They became part of global culture, referenced, parodied, and reimagined endlessly. You don't need to have read the original The Emperor's New Clothes to understand when someone says the emperor has no clothes. The phrase exists independently now. This is what happens to truly successful art. It escapes its creator's control. It becomes public property, reshaped by each generation to serve their needs. Andersen wrote these stories in 19th century Denmark, but they now belong to everyone everywhere. The question is why? Why did these particular stories, out of thousands of fairy tales written in the 19th century, achieve this level of cultural penetration? What makes them stick when so many others have been forgotten? Part of it is timing. Andersen was writing just as literacy was spreading, as publishing was becoming industrialized, as the concept of childhood as a distinct phase of life was emerging. His fairy tales arrived at exactly the right moment to ride these cultural waves. Part of it is translation. Unlike some writers whose work loses everything in translation, Andersen's stories survived the jump between languages remarkably well. The plots were strong enough, the images vivid enough, that they could be rendered in any language without losing their essential power. But there's something deeper. The stories work because they address universal human experiences through fantastic metaphors. Feeling like you don't belong, being judged by appearances, sacrificing everything for love, making terrible choices you can't undo. These aren't specifically Danish experiences. They're human experiences. Andersen understood something fundamental about fairy tales. They work best when they're both specific and universal. The details should be concrete, vivid, and strange. But the emotional core should be something anyone can recognize. The Little Match Girl is about a specific girl in a specific situation, freezing to death on New Year's Eve while people celebrate inside warm houses. But it's also about poverty, about being invisible to those with power, about the cruelty of indifference. The specificity makes it real. The universality makes it resonate across cultures and centuries. His influence on children's literature is impossible to overstate. Before Andersen, fairy tales were collected folk stories, anonymous products of oral tradition. After Andersen, fairy tales could be authored works, literary creations with identifiable styles and perspectives. He essentially created the modern literary fairy tale as a form. The idea that a serious author could write original fairy tales, that these could be art rather than just entertainment for children. This was radical, and once Andersen proved it was possible, others followed. Oscar Wilde wrote fairy tales directly influenced by Andersen. So did George MacDonald, Lewis Carroll, and later J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. The entire tradition of fantasy literature, from The Lord of the Rings to Harry Potter, owes something to Andersen's demonstration that you could create new myths rather than just retelling old ones. His impact on Danish culture specifically was profound. He became Denmark's most famous cultural export, the figure who put Danish literature on the world map. Before Andersen, Danish writers were unknown outside Scandinavia. After Andersen, Denmark had a literary reputation. The Danish government recognised this early. They gave him that lifetime stipend, honoured him while he was alive, and turned his birthday into a national celebration after his death. His childhood home in Odense became a museum. Statues were erected, streets were named after him. But there's an uncomfortable aspect to this national embrace. Denmark claimed Andersen as a symbol of Danish cultural achievement, but Denmark also tormented him for much of his life. The critics who savaged his early work were Danish. The social barriers he struggled against were Danish. The people who made him feel like an outsider were Danish. He only became a national treasure after he'd proven himself internationally. Once Germany and England and France had validated him, Denmark decided he was worth celebrating. There's something revealing about that pattern. Andersen was aware of this irony. He wrote about it, complained about it, resented it. But he also craved Danish acceptance more than anything else. He wanted to be loved by his own country, not just admired by foreigners. He wanted to belong. He never quite did, even at the height of his fame, even when the king attended his funeral. There was always that distance, the sense that he was being honoured but not truly accepted, celebrated but not loved. This tension appears in the fairy tales themselves. The ugly duckling becomes a swan, but only by discovering he was never really a duckling to begin with. He doesn't transform, he reveals his true nature. Is that a story about acceptance or about the impossibility of real transformation? About finding where you belong, or about the tragedy of never truly belonging anywhere? Andersen left that question open, and maybe that's why the stories endure. They don't provide easy answers. They present situations, ask questions, and let readers draw their own conclusions. The Little Mermaid sacrifices everything for love and loses. Is that noble or foolish? The story doesn't tell you. It just shows you what happens and lets you feel what you feel. The Emperor is exposed as a fraud. Is the story about the courage to speak truth, or about the cruelty of public humiliation? Both readings exist in the same text. This ambiguity, this refusal to moralize, separates Andersen from most children's literature of his era. Victorian children's stories were relentlessly didactic. Every tale had a clear moral. Bad children were punished. Good children were rewarded. The universe was just and comprehensible. Andersen's universe isn't just. Good mermaids dissolve into foam. Innocent tin soldiers melt in fires. Devoted dogs die alone. The stories don't promise that virtue will be rewarded or that suffering has meaning. They just show human experience in all its complexity and randomness. This honesty is part of why they've aged so well. Stories that promise neat moral lessons date quickly. Stories that acknowledge life's messiness remain relevant. The 20th century brought new waves of Andersen scholarship. Psychoanalysts read the tales through Freudian lenses, finding sexual symbolism and unconscious desires. Marxist critics analyze the class dynamics and economic structures. Feminist scholars examine gender roles and power relationships. Each approach revealed something new. The tales were rich enough to support multiple readings. You could analyze The Little Mermaid as a story about gender dysphoria or colonialism or artistic ambition or religious transcendence. All these interpretations have textual support. This interpretive flexibility is a mark of great literature. Shallow work can only be read one way. Deep work reveals new meanings with each reading, with each generation, with each critical approach. Andersen's personal life became the subject of intense biographical interest. Scholars combed through his diaries, letters, and travel journals. They debated his sexuality, his psychological issues, his complex relationships. They tried to connect the life to the work, to find the man in the fairy tales. Some of this was illuminating. Understanding Andersen's loneliness and sense of alienation does help explain why these themes appear so consistently in his stories. Knowing about his unrequited loves adds depth to tales of impossible desire and sacrifice. But some of it missed the point. The fairy tales aren't autobiography. They're art. They transform personal experience into universal story. Trying to read them as coded memoirs reduces their power. Andersen understood this. He put himself into the stories, yes, but he also transcended himself. The Little Mermaid isn't just Andersen in aquatic form. She's a separate creation with her own existence, her own meaning beyond whatever personal experiences inspired her. By the late 20th century, Andersen's fairy tales had become so embedded in global culture that most people had encountered them without ever reading the originals. They knew the Disney versions, the simplified retellings, the references and parodies. This created a strange situation where the stories were universally known but rarely read in their original form. Everyone knew about The Ugly Duckling. Far fewer had read Andersen's actual text with its melancholy tone and ambiguous ending. Publishers tried to address this with new translations, illustrated editions, and scholarly annotations. Some aimed for accessibility, modernizing the language. Others prioritized fidelity to Andersen's Danish, preserving his specific word choices and rhythms. There's no perfect solution. Translation always involves compromise. Something always gets lost. But the best translations capture not just the words, but the tone, the feel, the particular music of Andersen's prose. Because Andersen's style matters, it's not just what he says, but how he says it. The conversational tone, the direct address to the reader, the sudden shifts between humour and darkness. These aren't incidental features, they're essential to how the stories work. Read a poorly translated Andersen and you'll wonder what the fuss is about. The plots seem thin, the morals unclear. Read a good translation and you'll understand why these stories have survived for 150 years. The language comes alive, the images burn into your memory, the emotional truth hits you. His legacy is complicated, like everything about him. He gave the world stories that have brought joy and meaning to millions, but he also struggled, suffered, and died alone. He achieved fame but not love, success but not belonging. The fairy tales he worried about, the ones he thought might be forgotten, became his immortality. Everything else he wrote, the novels and plays and poems he considered his serious work, faded into obscurity. Only the fairy tales endured. There's a lesson there, though probably not the one Andersen would have wanted to learn. Sometimes we're remembered for things we didn't value. Sometimes our throwaway work outlasts our masterpieces. Sometimes the art we create almost accidentally matters more than the art we laboured over. Andersen spent years trying to prove himself as a serious novelist and playwright. But his real genius emerged when he wrote quickly, intuitively, following his imagination wherever it led. The fairy tales poured out of him. The novels he had to force. You can feel the difference. The fairy tales have a spontaneity, a wildness the novels lack. They're less controlled, less concerned with being respectable. They're pure imagination, unfiltered by self-consciousness. That's what children respond to. That's what survives translation. Not the careful craftsmanship of his novels, but the raw creative energy of the fairy tales. He died not knowing this. He died thinking his novels were his legacy, his serious contribution to literature. He died worried the fairy tales might be forgotten. Instead, the opposite happened. The fairy tales survived because they were elastic. They could stretch to fit whatever meaning a reader needed them to have. That's not a weakness. That's why they're still here. The Little Mermaid transforms depending on who's reading it. For children, it's an adventure story about a mermaid who wants legs. For adults, it becomes a meditation on sacrifice and what we give up for love. For queer readers in the 20th century, it spoke to the pain of hiding your true nature, of living in a body that doesn't match who you are inside. Andersen didn't write it with any of that in mind. He wrote it heartbroken over Edvard Collins' rejection. But once the story was out there, it belonged to everyone. Readers found their own meanings in it. That's what happens with great art. It escapes the artist's intentions. The Ugly Duckling works the same way. Surface level, it's about a bird who doesn't fit in until he discovers he's actually a swan. Go deeper, and it's about anyone who's ever felt like they don't belong. The bullied kid, the immigrant, the artist in a family of accountants. The story adapts to fit whoever needs it. But here's what's strange. The duckling doesn't actually change. He was always a swan. He just didn't know it. The world around him was wrong about what he was. Once he finds other swans, suddenly he fits perfectly. Is that comforting or disturbing? It suggests that some people are just better than others, born superior. The duckling isn't transformed through effort or growth. He was special all along. Everyone else was trash, literally. The story validates him by degrading everyone who rejected him. You can read it as an elitist fantasy, or you can read it as a story about finding your people, the ones who recognize your worth when everyone else was blind to it. Both readings exist in the same text. Andersen probably meant it the first way. He believed in his own specialness, with an intensity that bordered on delusion. But readers have chosen to interpret it the second way, and their interpretation has won. The Emperor's New Clothes hits different now than it did in 1837. Back then it was a satire of vanity and gullibility. Now it's become shorthand for any situation where everyone pretends to see something that isn't there. Political spin, corporate doublespeak. The story predicted our relationship with truth. But notice what actually happens in the story. A child speaks up and says the emperor is naked. Everyone else already knew. They just didn't want to admit it. The child doesn't have special insight. The child just hasn't learned to lie yet. That's darker than it seems, because in the real world, the child grows up, learns to see the invisible clothes, becomes part of the system. The story ends with the truth spoken aloud, but it doesn't tell us what happens next. Does anything change? Or does everyone just go back to pretending? Andersen understood something about human nature that makes his fairy tales feel uncomfortably relevant. We're all capable of believing obvious lies if the social pressure is strong enough. We all know the emperor is naked, we just keep our mouths shut. The little match girl is the one that's hardest to stomach now. A child freezes to death on New Year's Eve, while people celebrate inside their warm houses. She lights matches to keep warm, has visions of her dead grandmother, and dies smiling. It's brutal, sentimental, but brutal. The girl dies and the story presents this as somehow beautiful, redemptive. She's reunited with her grandmother in heaven. Her suffering is over, but she's still dead. A child froze to death because nobody helped her. Andersen wrote it as social criticism. Look at this horrible thing that happens while you feast and celebrate. But the ending undercuts the critique. By making her death beautiful, by giving her heavenly reward, he almost justifies the system that killed her. She's better off dead than alive in poverty. Modern readers struggle with this. We want to rescue her, rewrite the ending, give her a happy life instead of a happy death. But Andersen wouldn't recognize that version. He believed suffering purified the soul. Death was release, not tragedy. The Red Shoes takes this even further. A girl gets magic shoes that won't stop dancing. She can't take them off. She dances until her feet bleed. Finally, an executioner cuts off her feet. She repents, becomes religious, and dies forgiven. What's the moral? Don't be vain. Don't want beautiful things. The punishment seems wildly disproportionate to the crime. She wanted red shoes. She gets her feet chopped off. And this is presented as a good outcome because she found God. You can psychoanalyze it. Andersen punishing himself for his own desires, whatever they were. Or you can see it as a product of its time, when children's literature was meant to terrify kids into obedience. Either way, it's hard to read now without flinching. But people still read it, still adapt it, still find meaning in the image of those red shoes dancing on their own. The shoes as obsession, as addiction, as any desire that takes control of your life. The story is cruel, but it's memorable. That counts for something. The Snow Queen is longer, more complex. Kay gets a shard of cursed mirror in his eye and heart. He sees everything as ugly and twisted. The Snow Queen takes him to her palace. Gerda, who loves him, searches for years and finally rescues him with her tears, which melt the ice in his heart. It's a story about love, conquering coldness, about persistence, about refusing to give up on someone even when they've changed into someone you don't recognize. But it's also about the fragility of innocence. One moment Kay is playing with Gerda, the next he's cruel and distant. The mirror shard did that. But what does the mirror shard represent? There's no clear answer. That's why the story keeps being adapted. Frozen took the basic structure and built something entirely different. The Snow Queen became Elsa. The mirror shard became fear and isolation. Gerda became Anna. The love that saves became sisterly instead of romantic. Disney's version is so dominant now that most people don't know Andersen's original. They think Elsa is the hero. In Andersen, the Snow Queen is the villain. She's beautiful and terrible, offering false comfort that's really imprisonment. Kay thinks he's happy in her palace. He's actually frozen, solving ice puzzles, forgetting everything he loved. Both versions work, that's the point. The story is flexible enough to hold multiple interpretations, multiple adaptations, multiple meanings. The steadfast tin soldier is smaller, quieter. A one-legged toy soldier falls in love with a paper ballerina. They never speak. He goes through various disasters, ends up back home, gets thrown in the fire by a random child. The ballerina blows in after him. They burn together. All that's left is a tin heart and a sequin. It's achingly sad, pointless. The soldier doesn't do anything wrong. He just loves someone he can't have. Fate or chance or a cruel child destroys him. There's no moral, no lesson, just loss. Andersen wrote it in 1838. He was 33, already famous but increasingly lonely. You can feel his isolation in the tin soldier, standing on one leg, unable to move, watching life happen around him but never participating. The soldier can't speak his love, neither could Andersen. The story resonates because everyone's felt that way. Loving someone who doesn't know you exist, watching opportunities burn up, being powerless while your life happens to you instead of because of you. It's Andersen at his most honest. Thumbelina is lighter but still strange. A tiny girl has adventures, gets kidnapped by various creatures who want to marry her, finally escapes to the land of the flowers where she marries a tiny prince. Happy ending, right? Except she never chooses anything. Things happen to her. She's passed from kidnapper to kidnapper. The toad wants her for his son. The mole wants her for himself. She's a possession, not a person. Even her happy ending comes because she helps a bird, who then carries her to safety. She's rewarded for kindness, but not agency. Modern adaptations struggle with this. They give Thumbelina more personality, more choices, but Andersen's version is what it is. A pretty girl moved around by others until she lands somewhere acceptable. It bothers us now. It probably should. The nightingale is different. A Chinese emperor prefers a mechanical bird to a real one because the fake bird is predictable, beautiful, controllable. When he's dying, only the real nightingale's song can save him. The bird returns, forgives the emperor, and promises to keep singing for him. It's about art versus artifice, real emotion versus manufactured sentiment. The mechanical bird is impressive, but dead inside. The real bird is imperfect but alive. Andersen understood this tension. He spent his life trying to be accepted by people who preferred the polished, predictable version of him to the messy reality. The emperor learns. Andersen never did. He kept trying to be the mechanical bird, the perfect artist, the respectable novelist. He couldn't accept that his value lay in the imperfect, wild, emotional fairy tales he wrote almost effortlessly. The Nightingale is Andersen arguing with himself, knowing the truth but unable to live it. The emperor gets a second chance. Andersen didn't feel like he got one. He died still trying to prove his worth through the wrong work. Every fairy tale he wrote contains some fragment of his own experience. The outsider, the misfit, the person who doesn't belong but believes someday they will. The suffering that must be endured before recognition comes. The transformation that changes everything. But the transformations in his stories are often ambiguous. The Ugly Duckling discovers he was always a swan. He didn't change, his circumstances did. The Little Mermaid sacrifices everything and gets nothing. The tin soldier burns, the match girl dies. These aren't simple happy endings. They're complicated, sometimes disturbing resolutions that suggest life doesn't always reward virtue or punish vice. Sometimes you suffer for no reason. Sometimes you discover you were special all along, but nobody noticed. Sometimes love isn't enough. Andersen knew this because he lived it. He became famous but not happy, celebrated but not loved. His fairy tales told the truth about life in ways his novels never could. They admitted that transformation is painful, that belonging is fragile, that even happy endings come with costs. That's why children can read them and adults can reread them, and both find something true. The stories work on multiple levels because life works on multiple levels. Surface and depth, comedy and tragedy, hope and despair. Andersen didn't set out to create immortal literature. He stumbled into it while trying to be something else. The work he dismissed became his legacy. The work he valued disappeared. There's probably a fairy tale in that, but he never wrote it. The fame came gradually, then all at once. By the 1840s, Andersen's fairy tales were being translated across Europe. Germany embraced them first, then France, England, Sweden. Publishers wanted more, readers demanded new collections. But Denmark remained sceptical. The Danish literary establishment never forgave him for succeeding with children's stories. They wanted serious novels, historical dramas, poetry that followed classical rules. Instead, they got talking animals and magical transformations written in conversational language that broke every convention. Andersen cared desperately what Denmark thought. He travelled constantly, seeking validation elsewhere, but always returned hoping this time would be different. This time they'd recognise his genius. They never did, not the way he wanted. His travels became legendary, over 30 trips outside Denmark between 1831 and his death. Italy, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Norway, England, Scotland, Turkey, Greece. He documented everything in travelogues that sold well, but not as well as the fairy tales. He loved Italy most. The warmth, the art, the way Italians accepted him as a fellow artist rather than an oddity. His novel, The Improvisatore, was set there, drawing on his experiences wandering through Rome and Naples. It was his biggest success as a novelist. Finally, he thought, they see I can write serious literature. They didn't care. They wanted more fairy tales. This drove him mad. He'd publish a novel, pour his soul into it, wait for the critical acclaim. It would come politely, then fade. Then he'd dash off a few fairy tales, barely thinking about them, and those would be translated into 6 languages before the year ended. The pattern repeated his entire career. He valued the wrong work. The work that came easily, that felt almost like cheating. That's what mattered. But he couldn't accept it. His friendship with Charles Dickens illustrates this perfectly. They met in 1847 when Andersen visited England. Dickens was at the height of his fame, and Andersen worshipped him. Here was a writer who'd risen from poverty like Andersen, who understood suffering, who turned his life into art. They got along well initially. Dickens was gracious. He introduced Andersen to London Literary Society. They attended theatre together. Andersen left thinking he'd found a kindred spirit. 10 years later, he returned to England and invited himself to stay with Dickens. What was supposed to be 2 weeks became 5. Andersen couldn't read social cues. He didn't notice Dickens growing increasingly desperate for him to leave. Andersen was needy, clingy, emotionally demanding. He required constant reassurance. He couldn't be alone. He wept over imagined slights. After Andersen finally left, Dickens posted a card in the guest room. Hans Andersen slept in this room for 5 weeks, which seemed to the family ages. Dickens stopped answering his letters. The friendship was over. Andersen never understood why. This happened repeatedly. He'd meet someone famous, convince himself they were best friends, then overwhelm them with his neediness until they pulled away. He collected rejections like other people collected stamps. The romantic rejections were worse. Andersen fell in love constantly, always with people who couldn't or wouldn't love him back. Ryborg Voigt was engaged to someone else. Sophie Ørsted was the daughter of a famous physicist who considered Andersen beneath her family. Louise Collin, his benefactor's daughter, rejected his proposal but wanted to remain friends. He proposed to Louise in a letter. She said no. They stayed close. This became the pattern of his life: intimacy without consummation, connection without commitment. Always the friend, never the lover. His obsession with Jenny Lind was the most public. The Swedish Nightingale, they called her. Opera singer, beautiful, talented, internationally famous. Andersen met her in 1840 and fell immediately, hopelessly in love. He wrote her constantly, visited her whenever possible, dedicated poems to her. Everyone knew. Jenny Lind knew. She was kind about it, which made it worse. She treated him like a dear friend. He wanted more. She couldn't give it. When she married someone else in 1852, Andersen was devastated. He'd spent 12 years hoping. The Little Mermaid, written in 1837, is sometimes read as being about Lind, though the dates don't quite work. It doesn't matter. Every hopeless love story he wrote was about someone. Modern scholars debate Andersen's sexuality. He never had a sexual relationship with anyone, as far as we know. Was he gay, asexual, just repressed? The evidence points in multiple directions. He had intense emotional attachments to men. His letters to Edvard Collin, Jonas's son, are passionate, desperate, pleading. He begged Edvard to use the informal du with him rather than the formal dd. Edvard refused, too intimate. Andersen wrote in his diary about attractions to young men. He also wrote about women. He seemed capable of romantic feelings toward anyone, but unable to act on any of them. Victorian society didn't have the categories we use now. You could have intense same-sex friendships without anyone calling them sexual. You could be celibate without anyone finding it strange. Andersen fit awkwardly into his time's understanding of desire. What's clear is he was lonely, profoundly, chronically lonely, despite being famous and having friends across Europe. He travelled constantly, but felt at home nowhere. He was welcomed everywhere, but belonged nowhere. The fairy tales came from this: the outsider who doesn't fit, the creature who's different, the transformation that might make you acceptable, the suffering that might be rewarded eventually. These weren't abstract themes, they were his life. By the 1860s, he was an international celebrity. The Danish government gave him the title of Councillor of State. When he visited his hometown of Odense in 1867, the entire city turned out to honour him. Torchlight procession, speeches, celebration. He'd made it. The poor shoemaker's son was now Denmark's most famous writer. They'd erected a statue to him while he was still alive. Kings and queens sought his company. He should have been happy. He wasn't. The recognition came too late, or in the wrong form, or from the wrong people. He was celebrated as a children's writer when he wanted to be respected as a serious novelist. He was loved across Europe but never felt truly accepted in Denmark. His health declined through the 1870s. Liver disease, possibly cancer. He grew weak, had trouble walking. Writing became difficult. He published his last fairy tale in 1872. Auntie Toothache. It's about a poet tormented by pain who questions whether his suffering has any meaning. He spent his final years being cared for by friends. The Melchior family took him in. He had a room in their house in Copenhagen. He was 70 years old and had never had his own home. Always a guest, always dependent, always grateful for others' kindness. He died August 4th, 1875. The cause was liver cancer. He'd been semi-conscious for days. The Melchiors were with him. So was Edvard Collin, the man he'd loved for decades, who'd never used the informal pronoun with him. After Andersen's death, they found a letter in a pouch he wore around his neck. It was from Ryborg Foyt, the first woman he'd loved, written 45 years earlier. He'd carried it his entire adult life. The funeral was massive. Copenhagen turned out. Royalty attended. The king himself sent a wreath. They buried him in Assistants Cemetery, the same cemetery where his benefactor Jonas Collin was buried. The obituaries praised his fairy tales, barely mentioned his novels. Even in death he couldn't escape being celebrated for the work he'd undervalued. But here's what's strange. His fairy tales did something his novels never could. They survived. The novels are forgotten now. Scholars read them to understand Andersen's life, but nobody reads them for pleasure. The fairy tales are everywhere. They've been translated into more than 125 languages, adapted into films, ballets, operas, plays. Disney built an empire partly on his work. Every child knows The Little Mermaid, The Ugly Duckling, The Emperor's New Clothes. Andersen wanted to be remembered as a serious artist. Instead, he's remembered as the greatest fairy tale writer who ever lived. He spent his life trying to achieve something he'd already accomplished without trying. There's irony in this that feels almost cruel. The man who wrote about transformation never transformed into what he wanted to be. The man who wrote about acceptance never felt accepted. The man who created the Ugly Duckling story never believed he'd become a swan. But maybe he had. Maybe the transformation happened and he just couldn't see it. He thought being a swan meant writing respected novels and being loved by the right people, what if being a swan meant writing stories that would outlive everyone who rejected him? The Danish critics who dismissed his fairy tales are forgotten. The literary establishment that never fully accepted him is dust. But children still read about the Little Mermaid who gave up her voice for love. Adults still recognize themselves in the tin soldier who loved from afar. The stories endure because they're true. Andersen died thinking he'd failed at what mattered. He'd succeeded at something bigger. He'd created myths, not in the ancient sense, but modern myths, stories that capture something essential about being human, about not fitting in, about suffering, about transformation, about the gap between who you are and who you want to be. Every outsider who's ever felt wrong in their own skin knows the Ugly Duckling. Every person who's loved hopelessly knows the Little Mermaid. Every child who's been told they're worthless knows the steadfast tin soldier. These aren't just stories, they're mirrors. Andersen couldn't see this. He was too close, too desperate for different validation. He wanted the respect of people who didn't matter. He got the love of millions who'd never met him. It wasn't what he wanted, but it's what he earned. The tragedy isn't that he failed, it's that he succeeded and never knew it. He wrote his own story over and over. The outsider, the misfit, the creature who doesn't belong. And every time, he couldn't see that the story was about him, that he was already transformed, that he'd always been special, that the suffering had meaning. He died in 1875. His fairy tales became immortal. That's the ultimate Andersen story, the transformation that happens after you stop looking for it. During Andersen's first years in Copenhagen, 1819 to 22, he fought desperately to gain a foothold in the theatre as a ballet dancer, actor or singer, and finally, when none of these attempts succeeded, he tried his hand as a playwright. This was also in vain, but resulted in the directors deciding to send him to school so that something proper might be made of him, and this experience was thus as decisive for his later life and work as the Odense years. A printer in Odense who had published handbills for the theatre had given Hans Christian a letter of introduction to a dancer, and the boy presented himself to her and sang and danced in his stocking feet before her astonished guests, who laughed uproariously at his absurd manner and brash behaviour, followed by 3 bitter years of poverty, where Hans Christian earned a little money singing in a boys' choir until his voice changed, tried to act and to join the ballet, but his awkwardness made these careers impossible, and he attempted to work with his hands, but could not do this either, though it never occurred to him to return home and admit defeat. For 3 years, Andersen lived in one of Copenhagen's most run-down areas, trying to become a singer, a dancer, and an actor, but he failed. The first significant help came from Jonas Collin, one of the directors of the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen, to which Andersen had gone as a youth in the vain hope of winning fame as an actor, with Collin raising money to send him to school. Although school was an unhappy experience for Andersen because of an unpleasant headmaster, it allowed him to be admitted to the University of Copenhagen in 1828. At last, when he was 17, Andersen came to the attention of Chancellor Jonas Collin, a director of the Royal Theatre, who had read a play by Andersen and saw that the youth had talent, though he lacked education. Finally, at the age of 17, Hans Christian's persistence paid off, with a chance encounter with Jonas Collin, who was the director of the Royal Danish Theatre, and had seen and read some of Andersen's works and felt that Andersen showed promise, and Collin approached King Friedrich VI and managed to convince the king to pay for part of Andersen's education. Jonas Collin, a well-connected arts patron and advisor to the king, served as benefactor to the young Hans, and Andersen would enjoy a lifelong friendship and closeness with the entire Collin family, even once proposing to the daughter, Louise. Though he was rejected, but they remained good friends. Hans Christian Andersen began his education in the towns of Slagelse and Helsingør on the Danish island of Zealand, and despite receiving the finest schooling, he was an average student, possibly because he suffered from dyslexia, and was mocked by other pupils for his desire to become a writer, and at one point he lived at his schoolmaster's home, where he was physically abused, with Andersen later describing his time in school as the most unhappy period of his life. H.C. Andersen would go on to be educated in the towns of Slagelse and Helsingør, both towns located near Copenhagen on the island of Zealand, and Hans Christian did not excel as a student, was alienated by his fellow students, and was continually mocked by his teachers for his ambition to become a writer, with Andersen describing his time in school as the bitterest time of his life. Although Andersen received a scholarship to study and sponsorship by King Frederick VI, he experienced many difficulties as a student, lived at the headmaster's home at Slagelse, where he was unhappy and purportedly treated badly in order to build character, and he was not a good speller and was discouraged from writing, a situation that may have been exacerbated by dyslexia. In 1827, his despair led Jonas Collin to remove him from school and organise for Andersen to complete his studies in Copenhagen with a private teacher. And in 1828, the 23-year-old passed the required exams for entrance into the University of Copenhagen. In 1829, during his first year of university studies, Andersen achieved his first notable literary success with a short story entitled A Journey on Foot from Holman's Canal to the East Point of Amager. And during the same semester, he published a comedy and a collection of. Andersen's work first gained recognition in 1829 with the publication of a short story entitled A Journey on Foot from Holman's Canal to the East Point of Amager, and he followed this with the publication of a play, a book of poetry, and a travelogue, with the promising young author winning a grant from the king, allowing him to travel across Europe and further develop his body of work. Andersen's writings began to be published in Danish in 1829, and in 1833 the king gave him a grant of money for travel, with him spending 16 months wandering through Germany, France, Switzerland, and his beloved Italy, with his first works being poems, plays, novels, and impressions of his travels. A novel based on his time in Italy, The Improvisatore, was published in 1835, and the same year Andersen began producing fairy tales. Though despite his success as a writer up to this point, Andersen did not initially attract attention for his writing for children. In 1835, Andersen completed his first novel, The Improvisatore, and he published his first small volume of fairy tales, an event that attracted little attention at the time. But The Improvisatore, like most of Andersen's novels, was based on his own life, and it was a success not only in Denmark, but also in England and Germany. Andersen's first book of tales, Eventyr, Fortalt for Børn, 1835, Tales Told for Children, included stories such as The Tinderbox, Little Claus and Big Claus, The Princess and the Pea, and Little Ida's Flowers. In 1835, Andersen published Fairy Tales Told for Children, 4 short stories he wrote for a little girl, Ida Thiele, who was the daughter of the Secretary of the Academy of Art, with the stories being Little Ida's Flowers, The Tinderbox, Little Claus and Big Claus, and The Princess and the Pea. And he seems to have published these short stories with little appreciation of their worth and returned to the writing of novels and poems. Danish reviews of the first 2 booklets first appeared in 1836 and were not enthusiastic, with the critics disliking the chatty, informal style and apparent immorality, since children's literature was meant to educate rather than to amuse, and the critics discouraged Andersen from pursuing this type of style, with Andersen believing that he was working against the critics' preconceived notions about fairy tales, and he temporarily returned to novel writing, waiting a full year before publishing his 3rd instalment. At first, Andersen was not very proud of his fairy tale writing, and after talks with friends and Danish critics, he considered giving them up, but he later came to believe that the fairy tale would be the universal poetry poetry that exists in all cultures, of which so romantic writers dreamed, and he saw fairy tales as the poetic form of the future, combining folk art and literature and describing both the tragic and the comical elements of life. These collections broke new ground in both style and content, with Andersen being a real innovator in his method of telling tales, using the idioms and constructions of the spoken language, thus breaking with literary tradition. Andersen began his fairy tale writing by retelling folk tales he'd heard as a child from his grandmother and others, but soon he began to create his own stories, with most of his tales being original. Only 7 of the 156 fairy tales and stories that Andersen published in his lifetime are retellings, in his own style, of folk tales. Andersen also heard folk tales recounted by the poor women of Odense, and he later renewed acquaintance with these stories by reading Kinder- und Hausmärchen, Child and Household Tales, 1812 to 1815, by Jacob Grimm and Wilhelm Grimm, as well as the Danish counterpart, Danske Folkeeventyr, Danish Folk Tales, 1822, collected by Matthias Winter, and Andersen was also influenced by the German tales known as Kunstmärchen, written by Ludwig Tieck, E. T. R. Hoffmann, Adelbert R. T. von Chamisso, and Friedrich de la Motte Fouquet. The first volumes, written from 1835 to 1837, contained 19 stories and were called Fairy Tales Told for Children, and in 1845 the title changed to New Fairy Tales, with the 4 volumes appearing with this title containing 22 original tales and considered Andersen's finest works. In 1852 the title was changed to Stories, and from then on the volumes were called New Fairy Tales and Stories, and during the next years Andersen published a number of volumes of fairy tales, with his last works of this type appearing in 1872. New collections appeared in 1843, 1847 and 1852, and the genre was expanded in Nye Eventyr og Historia, 1858 to 72, New Fairy Tales and Stories. The label Stories refers in the oeuvre of Hans Christian Andersen a movement towards a much more experimental, and in some cases, even more realistic style, primarily for adult readers. When Andersen dropped Told for Children from his titles, he wasn't abandoning young readers. He was acknowledging what he'd known all along. The best fairy tales work on multiple levels simultaneously. A child reads The Ugly Duckling and sees a story about acceptance. An adult reads it and recognises Andersen's own painful journey from poverty and rejection to fame. Both readings are valid. Both are there. By the 1840s, international recognition was flooding in. Germany embraced him first. The translator of his novel, Only a Fiddler, wanted to include a biographical essay, so Andersen sent his life story. That essay spread across Europe like wildfire. People weren't just reading the fairy tales, they were obsessed with the man who wrote them. The shoemaker's son who became a literary celebrity, the ugly duckling who became a swan. It was the ultimate fairy tale, and it was real. England invited him in 1847. He met Charles Dickens, his literary idol. The visit went well enough that Dickens invited him back in 1857. This second visit became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Andersen was supposed to stay 2 weeks. He stayed 5. Dickens grew increasingly desperate for his guest to leave. When Andersen finally departed, Dickens posted a note in the guest room. Hans Andersen slept in this room for 5 weeks, which seemed to the family ages. He stopped answering Andersen's letters. Their friendship ended. Why did Andersen overstay so badly? He was terrified of sailing. Even the short crossing between Danish islands paralysed him with fear. Getting back to Denmark from England required facing that terror. So he delayed and delayed until his host couldn't stand it anymore. But Andersen's fear of water went deeper than simple phobia. It connected to his obsessive anxiety about death. He carried a rope in his luggage when he travelled, convinced he'd die in a hotel fire and need to escape from a window. He left notes by his bedside reading, "I only appear to be dead because he was terrified of being buried alive." He documented every illness, every symptom, certain that each cold was actually a fatal disease. The personal relationships that might have grounded him never materialized. Ryborg Voigt, his first love, was engaged to someone else when they met in 1830. Sophie Ørsted, daughter of the famous physicist, didn't return his affection. Louise Collin, his benefactor's daughter, rejected his proposal but remained a friend. He fell desperately in love with the Swedish opera singer Jenny Lind, following her across Europe, writing her passionate letters. She called him brother. He wanted more. She gave him nothing. When Andersen died in 1875, they found a small pouch on his chest. Inside was a letter from Ryborg Voigt, 45 years after they'd met. He'd carried her rejection against his heart his entire adult life. The pattern was always the same. Andersen fell in love with people who were unavailable, inappropriate, or simply not interested. Some scholars suggest he was gay or bisexual, that his passionate friendships with men like Edvard Collin revealed desires he couldn't openly acknowledge in 19th century Denmark. Others argue he was simply emotionally immature, forever seeking the unconditional love he'd lost when his father died. The truth is probably more complicated than either explanation. What we know is that loneliness saturates his work. The Little Mermaid gives up her voice and accepts excruciating pain for a love that's never returned. The steadfast tin soldier loves the paper ballerina from afar, never speaking to her, eventually melting in a fire while she burns beside him. The little match girl freezes to death on New Year's Eve, while families celebrate inside warm houses. These aren't just sad stories, they're studies in isolation, in being on the outside looking in. Andersen achieved everything he'd dreamed of as a boy. Fame, recognition, financial security. The King of Denmark granted him an annual stipend at age 33. He travelled throughout Europe, welcomed by nobility and celebrated by crowds. He lived part-time in what would become the Royal Palace complex in Copenhagen. Critics who'd dismissed his early fairy tales now praised him as Denmark's greatest writer. But success didn't cure the fundamental wound. He remained the boy whose mother washed other people's clothes, the teenager who arrived in Copenhagen with nothing, the student whose headmaster beat him and told him he'd never be a writer. External validation couldn't touch that internal emptiness. His later fairy tales grew darker, more complex. The Shadow tells the story of a man whose shadow detaches, becomes independent, and eventually replaces him. The Shadow becomes successful, marries a princess, and has the original man executed. It's a disturbing meditation on identity, on the relationship between reality and appearance, on what we lose when we achieve success. The Ice Maiden runs to over 30,000 words, more novella than fairy tale. It follows a young man from childhood to his death, exploring fate, love, and the forces that shape our lives. The Ice Maiden herself is a figure from Swiss folklore, but Andersen transforms her into something more primal. She represents death, but also the cold beauty of nature, the sublime that kills even as it attracts. These late stories didn't achieve the same popularity as The Little Mermaid or The Ugly Duckling. They're too long, too complex, too dark, but they show Andersen pushing against the boundaries of the fairy tale form, trying to make it do things it had never done before. The label stories rather than fairy tales signalled this ambition. He wasn't just entertaining children anymore, he was creating literature. The final collection appeared in 1872. Andersen was 67 years old. His health was failing. He'd survived liver cancer in 1872, but the treatment left him weakened. In 1874, he fell out of bed and injured himself badly. He never fully recovered. He spent his last years at the home of his friends, the Melchior family. They cared for him as his strength faded. On August 4th, 1875, Hans Christian Andersen died in Copenhagen. He was 70 years old. The funeral was a national event. The King of Denmark attended. Thousands lined the streets. The boy from Odense's slums was buried with the honours of a prince. His coffin was followed by representatives from every level of Danish society, from the royal family to the working poor. But here's what's strange. For all his fame during his lifetime, Andersen's literary reputation initially declined after his death. The novels and plays he'd considered his important work were quickly forgotten. Only the fairy tales endured, and for decades they were viewed primarily as children's literature. Charming, certainly. Well-crafted, but not serious. The 20th century changed that. Scholars began examining the tales more carefully, recognizing their psychological depth, their innovative narrative techniques, their willingness to confront difficult truths. The Little Mermaid isn't just a love story, it's about the cost of transformation, the pain of trying to become something you're not, the tragedy of unrequited desire. The Emperor's New Clothes isn't just funny, it's a devastating critique of groupthink, vanity, and the fear of appearing foolish. Translation helped too. Andersen's fairy tales were translated into over 125 languages, spreading across cultures that had never heard of Denmark. The stories proved remarkably portable. A Japanese child could understand The Ugly Duckling as easily as a Danish one. The specifics changed, but the emotional core remained universal. Disney's 1989 film, The Little Mermaid, introduced Andersen to a new generation, though the animated version sanitized his ending. In Andersen's original, the mermaid doesn't get the prince. She's given the choice to kill him and return to the sea, but she can't do it. Instead, she throws herself into the ocean and dissolves into foam. Disney gave audiences a wedding. Andersen gave them tragedy and transformation. The gap between the two versions reveals something important about why Andersen's tales endure. They can be adapted, softened, made palatable for children, but the originals remain, waiting for readers ready to confront their darkness. The Red Shoes ends with the protagonist having her feet chopped off because she can't stop dancing. The Girl Who Trod on the Loaf sinks into hell for her pride and vanity. These aren't comforting bedtime stories. They're moral fables with teeth. In 1805, Andersen was born into poverty in Odense. In 1875, he died famous in Copenhagen. The external journey was remarkable. The internal journey was something else entirely. He spent his life trying to escape the circumstances of his birth, to prove he belonged among the educated and cultured. He succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation, and yet the wound never healed. His fairy tales are his real autobiography, not the sanitized version he published in 3 volumes, not the carefully constructed public persona. The tales reveal what he really felt: the loneliness, the desire for acceptance, the fear of rejection, the knowledge that transformation is possible but painful. That beauty and ugliness are often matters of perspective, that the world is cruel to those who are different. April 2nd is now celebrated as International Children's Book Day in honour of Andersen's birthday. It's fitting, though perhaps ironic. The man who wrote some of the world's most famous children's stories never had children. The writer who created The Ugly Duckling, a tale about finding where you belong, never quite found it himself. The author who gave us The Little Match Girl, freezing to death while others celebrated, died surrounded by friends, but fundamentally alone. 156 fairy tales and stories. That's what he left us. Some are masterpieces that will endure as long as people tell stories. Others are minor works, interesting primarily to scholars. But taken together, they represent something unprecedented. A body of work that operates simultaneously as children's entertainment and serious literature. Stories that reward rereading, that reveal new layers each time you encounter them. Andersen proved that the fairy tale could be art, not folk tales collected and transcribed, but original literary creations using the fairy tale form to explore complex themes. The talking animals and magical transformations weren't childish devices. They were tools for examining human nature, for making the abstract concrete, for saying things that couldn't be said in realistic fiction. Every writer who's used fantasy to explore reality owes him a debt. Every story about transformation, about the outsider finding their place, about the cost of desire, echoes his work. He created a template that's been repeated, adapted, and reimagined countless times. The Ugly Duckling alone has spawned thousands of variations across every medium. But the original stories remain distinct. Andersen's voice is unmistakable once you know it, the melancholy underneath the magic, the awareness that happy endings come with asterisks, the understanding that growing up means leaving things behind, that every gain involves loss, that the world is beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The shoemaker's son from Odense changed literature, not through grand novels or epic poems, though he wrote both, through fairy tales, through stories short enough to read in minutes, but deep enough to contemplate for years, through characters who feel real despite being mermaids, tin soldiers, and ugly ducklings. That's the final transformation. The boy who was mocked and rejected, who arrived in Copenhagen with nothing, who suffered through school and failed relationships and constant anxiety, he became immortal. Not through the novels and plays he valued most, through the fairy tales he almost gave up on, the stories critics initially dismissed, the works he created despite being told they weren't real literature. Hans Christian Andersen's life was a fairy tale, just not the Disney version. It was the original kind, where transformation is possible but painful, where success doesn't erase the past, where the ugly duckling becomes a swan but never forgets being ugly, and where the stories you leave behind matter more than the recognition you receive while living. 150 years after his death, children still read his tales, adults still find new meanings in them. And somewhere in those stories, the lonely boy from Odense still speaks, telling us what it means to be different, to desire acceptance, to transform despite the cost. That voice will never be silenced. That's the real magic. A man died carrying a 45-year-old love letter against his heart. He'd achieved everything except the one thing he wanted, and the work he almost abandoned became his immortality. That's the paradox of Hans Christian Andersen. He spent 70 years trying to become something he'd already become. The transformation happened while he was looking the other way. While he was chasing respect, that didn't matter. Writing novels nobody remembers, seeking love from people who couldn't give it. The fairy tales he undervalued outlived everyone who rejected him. The critics who dismissed them are forgotten. The literary establishment that never fully accepted him is dust. But the Little Mermaid still dissolves into foam. The Ugly Duckling still discovers it was a swan all along. The tin soldier still burns for love that was never returned. 156 stories. That's what remains. Some are masterpieces, others are footnotes. But together, they form something unprecedented. A body of work that's simultaneously children's entertainment and serious literature. Stories that work on multiple levels because life works on multiple levels. Andersen proved the fairy tale could be art, not collected folklore, but original literary creation. Every fantasy writer since owes him a debt. Every story about transformation, about outsiders finding their place, echoes his work. He created a template that's been repeated endlessly, but the originals remain distinct. That melancholy underneath the magic, the awareness that happy endings have asterisks, the understanding that every gain involves loss. The shoemaker's son from Odense changed literature forever, not through the novels he valued most, through the fairy tales he almost gave up on. The stories critics told him weren't real literature, the works he created despite being told to stop. He died thinking he'd failed at what mattered. He'd succeeded at something bigger. He'd created myths that would outlive kingdoms. And the boy who never felt he belonged anywhere now belongs to everyone. That's the real fairy tale, the transformation that happens when you stop looking for it.